Hey all you whiskey fans, have you ever heard about Japanese oak, Mizunara, and thought, what is it, what does it taste like, and why is it so expensive? Well, grab a glass, let's talk about it. Now, being an American whiskey fan, I love American oak. So when I heard about Japanese oak, I was a bit skeptical. From what I know about Japanese whiskey distilling, a lot of it, well, let's say, came from the tradition of sake, which is quite a different process than whiskey, and the whiskey which is now being made is imitating Scotch whiskey. But things are changing, and it's becoming more and more interesting and more exciting because they're finding their own way of making whiskey, of changing what the actual, let's say, kind of recipe or flavor profile of Japanese whiskey is, and Mizunara Oak is doing that in some pretty interesting ways. Now, one of the problems with Mizunara Oak is it's extremely rare and it's very expensive, so any whiskey that you're going to pick up is probably going to cost you a few bucks. Now, we'll talk about a cheaper alternative if you want to taste it and try it, but it's not quite the same. Let me explain. Before getting into the whiskey and what's in my glass, let's talk a little bit about Mizunara Oak. It's rare and it's expensive because if you think about parts of the whiskey world that usually produce barrels, you're thinking France, you're thinking the Americas, and these are big places, big countries with a lot of forest and a lot of timber and a lot of wood. Japan is not quite as large. What's also challenging is the wood is very different. The oak, as you can kind of see here, is much thinner. The trees don't get as big or as robust. And this means that you have less wood to work with as well. Not only that, but the actual wood staves, or the piece of woods which get cut and later put into the barrel, are also much more porous. That means, almost like a sponge, they have bigger little holes there, and more whiskey can run through these little holes, meaning you're losing more whiskey year on year to the angel share, to climate, and let's say also just to evaporation. Meaning the whiskey that actually comes out of it at the end is even more rare and even more expensive. Now, from a technical standpoint and kind of, let's say, trickier situation, I was really interested in how the staves or how the barrels of Mizunara Oak are actually assembled and put together. Many of you might be comfortable or heard of the idea that the best barrels need to be aged or dried outside for a period of time. Usually, let's say for American oak, this is 6 months for the very cheap stuff and a couple years for the, let's say, the higher quality barrels. In French oak, it can even be less than that. It depends again, there's always variation, but usually you're under or around the 2-year mark for French oak as well. What's very interesting about Mizunara Oak, you have to age these staves for a minimum of 3 years. Minimum of 3 years before they are ready to be formed into a barrel and actually assembled. This is very critical and crucial to defining a very good spirit or whiskey, because if your wood is not aged enough and the staves are still a little bit green, I say green for multiple reasons. A, if you've ever cut a piece of wood, you've noticed when it's still kind of alive and fresh, it has that green kind of look to it. It's not sappy, but it's like alive, it's green. And it has kind of a fresh cut grass smell or an aroma. Well, that's the same thing that would carry over into a barrel if you use fresh staves, and that's not necessarily a flavor that we like in whiskey, so we try to avoid it. Now, instead of that, let's say, green, fresh cut tree smell, what you actually get when you age the wood for around 3 years or so is more sandalwood, coconut rich and creamy aromas as well, but kind of like a honey sweetness in some ways. But just in case you thought, hey, 3 years is a long time as a minimum age to have for a stave, don't worry, because it gets even worse. Before they can actually cut down a Japanese oak Mizunara tree, they need to wait a minimum of 200 years. Yes, 200 years. And for those of you which think, well, hey, American oak barrels or American oak, it's even older, or French, Yeah, but only the best. The typical American oak, which is harvested for a barrel, is anywhere from 80 to 120 years old. And French oak, again, can be even younger, but usually ranges from 150 to 200 for the higher quality stuff. Now, we know, okay, the staves need to be aged for a long time. The tree needs to be very old. Get this. You know, in American oak barrels, you get a lot of flavor. They say, hey, these barrels should not be, or whiskey which is put into these barrels should not be aged for too long. Recommended is less than 10 years. Well, they say the minimum age to be, let's say, a very well balanced or to be a very good glass of Mizunara is around 2 decades. That's 20 years. And as you can see in this example here, they usually do a very good job, and they're usually very good whiskeys. They're usually very expensive, but you do find a lot of whiskeys which are younger using the same oak as well. Many of them are just using it for finishes, however, and not necessarily the entire aging. This makes a huge difference. So, okay, the wood is rare. You need to age it outside for a long time, and the whiskeys don't taste amazing until they're at least 20 years old. Why do people use it? Why not use a different barrel? Well, it's actually a traditional reason. So after World War II, Japan had a shortage, let's say, or after, even during. It was hard for them to get their hands on French oak and American oak. Go figure. Well, what did this mean? This means that they had to start cutting and using their own wood. And this led to the actual production and first experimentation with their oak trees for whiskey. Super interesting. I love it. I'm a big geek and a fan of stories like this. I mean, it's horrible that it was about World War II, but that it led them to start using and experimenting with their own products, their own wood, and finding what characteristics make them unique and special, I find as a very interesting piece of whiskey history. But this still doesn't answer the question, is it worth it? Now, in the whiskey world, we know that scarcity is one of the leading causes of a bottle costing more. Funny enough, in this case, it's not just the bottle that costs more, it's also the barrel. Now, by digging around, I found a few sources where I usually get my barrels from in Switzerland. They import from around the world, but let's dive into it a little bit because it's quite interesting, the variation that you get from one barrel of whiskey to the next barrel of whiskey. Now, while I talk about these prices and I show them to you quickly, keep in mind all the prices we're discussing are about 220 liters plus minus barrel size. And keep in mind that this is me as a small distiller looking to pick up a bottle. Of course, if you're a large distillery, you're going to be able to pick up these bottles in bulk and save quite a bit of money versus I have to struggle and pay a lot more. So the average barrel of American oak that lets me pick the toast, the char, and customize it how I want. Also, it comes from a good cooperage, which I trust and has not let me down in the past, cost about 600 euros. Almost one to dollars, a little bit more. Again, small distillery, buying at small quantities, one barrel at a time. In the US, the same barrel probably cost you 250, 300, but in Europe, of course, it's shipped here, it's put together here. There's way more process involved. That being said, French oak is not much cheaper. In fact, if you want very poor quality French oak, well, then there's a lot of options and you do get under 600. But if you're looking for good limousine oak, it's around 800 euros for a barrel, plus minus 220 liters. By the way, this is all about 50 gallons for those Americans who might be watching. Now it gets interesting. American oak, 600, French oak, limousine oak, 800. What does a barrel of Mizunara cost? 3,500. Yeah, that's a pretty penny. And when you think, okay, all this together, stave was aged for 3 years, tree is at least 200 years old, you lose a lot of whiskey, it takes 2 decades to get all the flavor out of it. It's nothing but art to why these barrels are used. And I think it speaks to why the characteristics in these whiskeys, or what that wood actually imparts onto the whiskey, makes it so rare, sought after, and very unique. So in conclusion, it doesn't matter how much these barrels cost. People love them. They're trying to make a lot of whiskeys out of them. Although there isn't a lot of barrels in stock, this means that in many cases, barrels are getting reused. And keep in mind, the first time, the second time, you still get a lot of whiskey flavor. But as you go further and further and further back, or use a barrel more times, well, then you're going to start losing this flavor. And these are new oak. So it's not like you can recharge it with sherry or recharge it with port and use it again. Once that flavor's gone, it's gone. And then it might just be marketing that it's aged in Mizunara Oak. Now with that, if you have never tried Mizunara Oak and you want to try something, I recommend finding a whiskey store around you that does whiskey tastings or whiskey events, somewhere that they might be occasionally opening up bottles and doing kind of a bottle sharing or giving you a unique chance to taste something special. I'm not going to say you're not going to like it, because I think most people will like what the oak tastes like, what the whiskey tastes like after it's in the oak, but it's very expensive. This bottle, which I also showed you before, yeah, it's a 100-year anniversary, it's 18 years old, but it still costs around 1,800 plus minus euros, Swiss francs. So I'm very lucky to have a store close by, Multimore in my case, that does whiskey tastings and events. And after chatting with them, they actually recommended this as a whiskey to check out and to try. This here is Chauvis Bros, or Chauvis Regal and Brothers, I guess, is the distillery, but let's not get too much into it. It's a very affordable bottle. This is only at 40 ABV, so you can imagine the audience it's for. But to taste and experiment and have a kind of a better idea of what this whiskey will taste like, and if you're going to like this oak, if you don't have access to a whiskey store that does tastings and openings, I would recommend you pick one of these up if you're really interested in seeing if there's a difference. Pick up a glass, try it, see if you like it, and then see if you're ready to spend more money or experiment further on it. Again, I think you're going to like it, but you never know until you try. With that, I'll let you get to it. Cheers to you. Your next glass of whiskey may be matured in Japanese Mizunara Oak. Bye now.